Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Each month we send happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee. That's everything from a 20th to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host, Eric Martin, creator and moderator of the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that meets weekly in the Chicagoland area, or at least it did before the coronavirus hit. For this outing, we're tackling a musical, and what a musical! In fact, the highest grossing Hollywood musical of them all. It's The Sound of Music, directed by Robert Wise, which was released 55 years ago. I climbed every mountain to find the spot-on guest for this episode and got the perfect person to say yes. It's Julia Hirsch, former story editor for Robert Wise and author of the book The Sound of Music, The Making of America's Favorite Movie. Julia and I will discuss a few of my favorite things and hers about this film, reminisce about something good worth celebrating all these years later, and before we say so long farewell, we'll examine this picture's cultural impact and legacy, how it stood the test of time, and more. Prior to sharing my talk with Julia, however, let's get some proper context on this month's movie, courtesy of Wikipedia. The Sound of Music is a 1965 American musical drama film produced and directed by Robert Wise and starring Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer with Richard Hayden and Eleanor Parker. The film is an adaptation of the 1959 stage musical of the same name, composed by Richard Rodgers with lyrics by Oscar Hammerstein II. The film's screenplay was written by Ernest Lehman, adapted from the stage musical's book by Howard Lindsay and Russell Krauss. Based on the memoir The Story of the Trapp Family Singers by Maria von Trapp, published in 1949, the film is about a young Austrian postulant in Salzburg, Austria, in 1938, who is sent to the villa of a retired naval officer and widower to be governess to his 7 children. Going back earlier, however, reveals an interesting backstory here. In 1956, German producer Wolfgang Liebeneiner first purchased the film rights for $9,000. The film The Trapp Family was released in West Germany on October 9, 1956, and became a major success. 2 years later, Liebeneiner directed a sequel called The Trapp Family in America, and the two pictures became the most successful movies in West Germany during the post-war years. Their popularity extended throughout Europe and South America. In 1956, Paramount Pictures purchased the United States film rights, intending to produce an English-language version with Audrey Hepburn as Maria. The studio eventually dropped its option, but one of its directors, Vincent J. Donahue, proposed the story as a stage musical for Mary Martin. Producers Richard Halliday and Leland Hayward secured the rights and hired playwrights Lindsay and Krauss, who had won the Pulitzer Prize for State of the Union. They approached Rodgers and Hammerstein to compose one song for the musical, but the composers felt that the two styles, traditional folk songs and their composition, would not work together. They offered to write a complete new score for the entire production if the producers were willing to wait while they completed work on Flower Drum Song. The producers quickly responded that they would wait as long as necessary. The Sound of Music stage musical opened on November 16, 1959 in New York City and ran on Broadway for 1,443 performances, winning 6 Tony Awards, including Best Musical. In June 1960, 20th Century Fox purchased the film adaptation rights to the stage musical for $1.25 million against 10% of the gross, and the rest, they say, is history. The Sound of Music was released on March 2, 1965 in the United States, initially as a limited roadshow theatrical release. It went into wide theatrical release on April 1, 1965. Although critical response to the film was mixed, the movie was a major commercial success, becoming the #1 box office movie after 4 weeks and the highest-grossing film of 1965. By November 1966, The Sound of Music had actually become the highest-grossing film of all time, surpassing Gone with the Wind, and it held that distinction for 5 years. The movie was just as popular throughout the world, breaking previous box office records in 29 countries. Following an initial theatrical release that lasted 4.5 years and 2 successful re-releases, the film sold 283 million admissions worldwide and earned a total worldwide gross of $286 million versus a production budget of $8.2 million. The Sound of Music received 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. The film also received 2 Golden Globe Awards for Best Motion Picture and Best Actress, the Directors Guild of America Award for Outstanding Directorial Achievement, and the Writers Guild of America Award for Best Written American Musical. In 1998, the American Film Institute listed The Sound of Music as the 55th greatest American movie of all time and the 4th greatest movie musical. In 2001, the United States Library of Congress selected the film for preservation in the National Film Registry, finding it culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Okay, let's turn on the Wayback Machine and tune in to the movie's original theatrical trailer.
Have sung for 1,000 years.
As I sound your signals, you will step forward and give your names. You, Fräulein, will listen carefully, learn their signals so you can call them when you want them.
The celebrated play that delighted the world. Actually photographed amidst the wondrous beauties of Salzburg, Austria, with the performance of a lifetime by the screen's brightest star, Julie Andrews, in the glorious role of Maria.
How do you solve a problem like Maria? How do you catch a cloud and pin it down? How do you find a word that means Maria? A flibbertigibbet or will-o'-the-wisp, a clown. Maria makes me laugh.
Maria, who entered the strange new world of Captain Von Trapp and captivated his 7 children with the magical spell of song.
Girls in white dresses with blue satin sashes, snowflakes that stay on my nose and eyelashes, silver white winters that melt into springs. These are a few of my favorite things. When the dog bites...
Fräulein, did I not tell you that bedtime is strictly to be observed in this house?
Yeah, you did, sir.
And do you or do you not have difficulty remembering such simple instructions?
Only during thunderstorms, sir.
Here, 2 new numbers specially written for the picture by Richard Rodgers, plus Rodgers and Hammerstein's immortal songs.
Doe, a deer, a female deer, Ray, a drop of golden sun, me, a name I call myself, far, a long, long way to run. I am 16, going on 17. I know that I'm naive.
Oh, please, Captain, love them all.
I don't care to hear anything further from you
I
about
am
my
not
children.
finished yet,
Oh,
Captain.
yes, you are.
You will pack your things this minute and return to the Abbey.
Captain Von Trapp, are you in love with him?
I don't know. Well, the Baroness said I was. She said that he was in love with me, but I didn't want to believe it.
You're far away. Where are you?
In a world that's disappearing, I'm afraid.
Is there any way I can bring you back to the world I'm in?
I love you.
So somewhere in my youth or childhood, I must have done something good.
Here is the perfect motion picture that touches every note in the full scale of human emotions.
right, it's that time of the show where I'm duty-bound to tell you that spoilers are ahead. But seriously, if you don't already know the plot of The Sound of Music, what have you been doing with your life? Either get thee to a nunnery or go watch The Sound of Music post-haste. Y'all back? Then it's time to introduce my distinguished guest, Julia Hirsch. Julia, thanks so much for agreeing to be a guest on Cineversary.
Thanks for having me.
So, tell us about your experience with this movie and the first time you saw it. Why is it so beloved by Julia Hirsch?
Well, I was 11 years old when The Sound of Music first came out in 1965, and I had seen West Side Story a year or two earlier. I don't remember exactly when. And I loved West Side Story. Of course, my sister told me, like, in the beginning, Tony dies at the end. So I cried throughout the whole movie. And my father kept saying, shut up, because I was crying in the theater. But when I saw Sound of Music, I remember leaving the theater and thinking, it's no West Side Story. I mean, I liked it. I just wasn't overwhelmed. But then, many, many years later, I started working for Robert Wise, who directed both West Side Story and Sound of Music.
Okay.
And that's how I got involved.
And in what capacity were you working for Robert Wise?
I started out as the secretary, and then I ended up being his story editor, which means I basically try to find stories and scripts and books that could be turned into movies for him to do. And I worked on Rooftops at the time was the movie that he was doing. I worked on the script of that too, and I worked on other scripts for him too.
Wow, that's fantastic. Okay. And what was it like working for Robert Wise? What was he like personally?
He was my heart. He was such a gentleman. He was old school, and he had this Midwestern kind of sensitivity about him. He was just a dear, dear man. When I went to work for him, he was already in his late 70s. He wasn't, at the height of his powers, but he became a dear friend. He and his wife both became a dear friend of mine, and he was just the nicest, most considerate person. And even people who worked with him in the 50s and 60s when he was at his height of his whatever, just always talked about what a gentleman he was, because honestly, Hollywood is not known for its gentlemen, and he was wonderful to me. He was great.
Oh, that's great to hear. Wow, what an awesome opportunity to be exposed not only to the industry, but a legend, a filmmaking legend.
Absolutely. And it was great working in his office because Steven Spielberg would call. I remember when Bob was talking to him about getting the Life Achievement Award or something from the Academy, and I remember hearing Spielberg going over the phone and just shouting. And, I got to talk to a lot of people. I got to know everyone who worked on The Sound of Music, which was why I decided that, I wanted to write the book.
That's a fantastic segue into some of these other questions, and I'm so glad I picked you as the guest and you said yes, because you're going to share great details of talking with and associating with so many different people affiliated with The Sound of Music. So this is a real treat. Thank you again. But what is it about The Sound of Music even today that resonates with you?
I think for the same reason it resonates with everybody. I mean, it is a perfect film. There are some films that just everything went well in the production of it, and Sound of Music is one of them. It had the perfect story, the perfect director, the perfect writer, Ernest Lehman,
right,
who really, which we can talk about later, just opened up the whole story. It had a great location. It had children. It had family. It was done perfectly, and there are not many movies like that. It basically speaks to our values, which is about courage, idealism, self-sacrifice, family, God, America as a beacon of hope. I think that especially now, with the way things are now, we really need those kinds of movies. So I don't think that's changed at all since it first came out.
Well, why do you think it still matters? What is it about The Sound of Music that has stood the test of time? Can you put your finger on it?
Well, I think it's everything I just said. I mean, it reflects our values. If you think about it, the captain was very courageous. I mean, in real life, what happened was they lived in Austria, and he was captain of the Navy at one time. Hitler came into power, And three things happened. Number one, his eldest son, Rupert, who was a doctor, was called to work for the Third Reich. They had been singing around Austria already by then. They were pretty well known as the Von Trapp family singers. They were asked to sing for Hitler at a party or one of the festivals or something. And the captain was also asked to come and join the Navy again, and obviously for the Third Reich. So those three things. Now, think about that. He decided instead to leave everything that he knew and his homeland, which he loved, because of his ideals, because of his values.
No, that's pretty amazing. Absolutely. I mean, there's so much of the true story that was adapted accurately into the movie and, of course, the musical. And they did take artistic license with a lot of other things. But to your point,
Right.
the values still resonate. I think it really still matters because, in my opinion, it remains arguably the greatest songbook for a major musical. Almost all of the dozen or so songs featured in the film are all-time classics, and several are standards covered by artists across many genres, like My Favorite Things, Do Re Mi, Edelweiss, 16 Going on 17, Maria, Climb Every Mountain, the title track. This music is woven so firmly into the public consciousness and pop culture that most film watchers know the lyrics by heart, which you can't always say about any other Hollywood musical except perhaps The Wizard of Oz. And you think about the popularity of sing-along theatrical reissues and the costumed events over the year, the fact that the soundtrack album has sold, I read, more than 20 million copies worldwide. You know, with most movie musicals, Julia, you might like half of the songs. You might, favor a couple of standout numbers.
It's true.
But here, I would argue that at least 8 of the 11 main songs are instant classics. And interestingly, I was paying more attention this recent rewatch of The Sound of Music. And as with The Wizard of Oz, I found that the vast majority of songs appear in the first half of the movie. In this case, 9 of the 11 main songs, not including, of course, reprises. But that was kind of interesting. So in a lot of these classic musicals that really resonate with the public, it seems like they get the strong songs out earlier in the film, and it just kind of pulls you in, and maybe you could tell more of the story later. But I think it matters, too, because as you already demonstrated talking about Robert Wise, you have the synergy of so many great talents behind the production, right? You've got the timeless tunes of composer Richard Rodgers and lyricist Oscar Hammerstein, the fantastic screenplay adaptation by, as you mentioned, Hollywood legend Ernest Lehman, the scintillating singing and performance of Julia Andrews, who's in her absolute prime, had just won the Oscar the year before, and then, of course, Robert Wise, a filmmaker already known by the time for helming a handful of classics. And let's not forget, I mean, he won the Oscar for Best Director on this film, too.
And producer.
That's right. And I also think that it has stood the test of time for me because despite complaints by some of being schmaltzy or saccharine, it's eternally crowd-pleasing and immensely joyful. It's fairly accurate as a true story about how a woman brought life and love into a family. And it remains one of the best pictures of its kind about a family and for families to enjoy together. It's kind of a last of its kind movie in a way. It marks the end of the family-friendly Hollywood musical, at least a musical that has remained widely beloved by movie fans. So in the immediate years after The Sound of Music, you had like Dr. Dolittle, Oliver, Fiddler on the Roof, and a few others that were kind of all ages appropriate musicals. But you tell me if you disagree, Julia. None of these are as rewatched and treasured today as The Sound of Music.
I would agree with that, although I think Fiddler on the Roof is also a total classic. But even Robert Wise and Julie Andrews tried to reprise their partnership with Star, which came out like a couple of years later and did not do well. It's hard to kind of recreate something perfect. It really is. I mean, you see that when people try to do sequels to movies too that are like so good. Why are you trying to do a sequel?
Right.
And I just think everything worked. The synergy was just really great on Sound of Music. But I don't know. You might be right. It might have been the last of its kind. I know that the movie musical basically ended not long after that. I mean, after the 60s, we didn't have good musicals until Chicago.
Yeah, like Moulin Rouge, Chicago, a few others in the 2000s. But
Yeah, there was like a huge span in between.
yeah, they fell out of favor, just as
I think
Westerns did for a while and some other genres.
we didn't have Rodgers and Hammerstein anymore. And that kind of ended the movie musical genre. I mean, obviously, Fiddler on the Roof wasn't Rodgers and Hammerstein, and we have Sondheim. But you know what? There still has never been anyone like Rodgers and Hammerstein.
No, such a genius partnership, no question. And I think it's just a testament to their genius. This was their last collaboration and arguably their best, most popular work.
Yes.
And it's really hard to top that partnership. There's Lerner and Lowe. There's, as you said, Sondheim. There's, of course, the Arthur Freed unit from MGM. There are a lot of, masterworks of the musicals. Despite being a family-friendly live-action musical, a genre that arguably doesn't appeal to as many people today as it did decades ago, I think another thing in its favor is the film doesn't look or feel dated. So part of the reason is that, why? The songs remain so universally beloved and evergreen, right? But another reason is that it's a period story. It's set in the late 30s in Austria. It's not the mid-1960s America when it came out. Perhaps you can't say the same thing about West Side Story. I'm not trying to besmirch a classic here, but that's a film released just a few years earlier that depicts, early 60s street gangs. Maybe they haven't aged too favorably in the public's consciousness. It'll be interesting to see what Spielberg does with his remake of it. But in any event, just to kind of compare some contemporary musicals. But I think that it's also aged well because the studio lavished a large budget and generous TLC on the production. So, for example, it makes such a huge difference, I think you'd agree, that many of the exterior shots were fittingly filmed on location in Austria, lending the movie a cultural authenticity and architectural verisimilitude that couldn't have been duplicated had the entire film been shot in Hollywood, right? Like, for example, when you think of Brigadoon, right? I mean, they totally botched that. That could have been so amazing if it were shot outdoors on location in Scotland or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of my least favorite musicals of all time, Brigadoon, and least favorite movie musicals. I will tell you that shooting in Salzburg is a huge reason why it was a perfect movie.
Yeah, I agree.
First of all, it's gorgeous. Second of all, there's Ernest Lehman again. To go back to him, it's funny because the opening of West Side Story was that, big, looking down at the gangs and the way that, they were dancing in the beginning. And Ernest Lehman suggested to Bob Wise they do the same thing for Sound of Music. And he was like, no, I've already done it. And Ernest Lehman said, no, you don't realize it. We're going to do these overhead shots from a helicopter of Salzburg. And then Julie's going to run up the hill and it's going to be something else. And Wise really thought that for a while. And then he thought, well, he's right. It's the best thing to do for this movie. And it sets it up.
Totally.
It sets it up so well.
Yeah, I mean, he made major contributions. I was watching in some of the making of featurettes on the Blu-ray. We don't have time to get into them all, but yeah, I mean, Ernest Lehman, he's Hollywood creme de la creme. I mean, he's the screenwriter of Sabrina, North by Northwest, West Side Story, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. This guy was such a masterstroke to get for this production. You think about how the movie today continues to look rich and chromatically resonant thanks to it being filmed in glorious 70mm Todd AO widescreen and produced with deluxe color processing. And these things really matter because this is now a 55-year-old movie by virtue of us celebrating it on Cineversary here. But when you think about so many other movies, even of the time or a few years earlier, that haven't aged as gracefully in its visuals, because the film stock has deteriorated. They put a lot of resources into this production, and I think that has really helped matters.
I agree.
Last thought on this before we go to the next question. I think The Sound of Music absolutely matters because it was and it remains immensely popular. You can't deny this fact, and nobody can. The film remained in theatrical circulation, I read, between 1965 and 1969. Now, that's an amazing 4 years. You think about how long a shelf life is for a movie today. You're lucky if you get a few weeks, right?
Right.
So you consider that this was the first American movie I read to be completely dubbed, both music and dialogue, in a foreign language. Again, immensely popular. The picture was also a big hit in virtually every country where it ran, except I was reading Germany and Austria for some
obvious reasons.
Right. And it continues to be one of the most performed musicals in the world. There was some fact I was reading that over 500 requests for licensing of the musical, among high schools, off Broadway, and so forth. So that just tells you everything you need to know about how popular this remains. But Julia, let's shift gears. I want to ask you how The Sound of Music was influential or set trends in any way.
I don't know if it set any trends, honestly. I don't think that anything that they tried to do after that was as successful.
Yeah, I mean, it is a difficult question to answer unless you're an absolute film historian. I think without this movie, you probably don't have modern live-action musicals of the contemporary era like Moulin Rouge or Mamma Mia or The Greatest Showman. Let me share a quote, for example. This is according to Pamela Hutchinson. Okay. She's a writer for The Guardian in the UK, and she wrote that perhaps the recent success of The Greatest Showman, as well as other fan favorites such as Mamma Mia, tell us critics and audiences want very different things from a musical. Where reviewers found The Sound of Music slow, sugary, and mendacious, audiences discovered a heartwarming story about childhood and a series of catchy, upbeat songs. I think what I'm getting at here and the trend I'm trying to identify, if I agree with what she was saying, is that even though a lot of people can kind of roll their eyes at The Sound of Music and its quote-unquote, saccharine nature, if they choose to look at it that way, it showed that family-friendly musicals are a thing. They can be extremely successful and popular. And you may not like The Greatest Showman or Mamma Mia or some of these other more modern musicals, but I think that they were inspired, at least to some extent, to be bankrolled as projects by virtue of, hey, look how popular The Sound of Music continues to be. Not everybody's going to hit on that winning formula, right? But I think that if we go with the theory that it was the last big one of its kind before things kind of changed, I think that there's still a glimmer of hope in some filmmakers' eyes that they can recapture some of that magic in some way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think also that this was the first studio musical to depict like the dark threat of Nazism and this time of uncertainty in Europe just before World War II. So I don't want to belabor this point, and it's a relatively minor point. But there are high stakes in this story, in this musical. It's not all frothy light and, rainbows. There is a real story being told, and there was a real threat to the family. And throwing this subplot of the Nazi threat in there, I think raises the stakes and helps it be distinguished among some other musicals of its kind that may not be taken quite as seriously.
Absolutely. And I don't think it was a subplot. I think it was the plot. Of the Nazis. Now, I will tell you that William Wyler was the first director that they wanted.
Yeah,
and
I read that.
He wanted to make it like even more political and darker. And they didn't want to do that.
Right.
The studio didn't want to do it. So he ended up leaving on his own. And that's when they said, okay, well, that's fine. And, but they wanted Robert Wise because he was more of a gritty director also, and they wanted to have sort of that grittiness in the movie to kind of, balance with the saccharine aspect of it.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. And of course, he's coming off the great success of West Side Story just a few years earlier. But yeah, Robert Wise, a man of many genres. You've got the director of The Haunting and The Day the Earth Stood Still, among many of the different kinds of films he's directed. Of course, he was on the Val Lewton Horror Unit, and he was Orson Welles' editor on Citizen Kane.
He was one of the most versatile directors
True.
Ever. I don't think there's ever been anyone like him since.
Yeah, and then he went on to, were you working with him at the time he directed the first Star Trek film?
Yeah.
So last thought here on possible influential elements. You think of how The Sound of Music kind of resonates today, too. Ariana Grande's song, 7 Rings, from last year was inspired by My Favorite Things. And I hear she has to pay 90% royalties on that song.
Really?
Yeah. I assume to the estate of Rodgers and Hammerstein. But anyway, Lady Gaga sang 4 numbers from The Sound of Music, if you recall, during the 2015 Oscars telecast. It enjoyed a Broadway revival in 1998. It was staged as a live TV production on NBC in 2013. It was remade again for the small screen in 2015. And again, as we talked about, there are so many Sound of Music sing-alongs, which sometimes include costume-wearing attendees that play today in many cities. It still captures everybody's heart. It still matters. So why do you believe most critics panned this film when it was originally released in 1965? And how and why did The Sound of Music's reputation as a film classic worthy of praise grow over the ensuing years?
Pauline Kael was a very influential critic at the time, and she didn't like it at all. I think they thought it was just too saccharine. I mean, it's got a nun and kids, and it's very cute, and, but that's just one part of it. I think people finally got wise to it and what it's really about and how it is so well needed. And no matter what, it could be the Vietnam War, it could be the Afghan War, it could be what we're going through now. All the ideas, all the values, all the underlying currents of the whole movie just resonate with everybody at any time.
It's just such an interesting phenomenon. I find it fascinating. And again, I'm a biased person here because I grew up loving the movie from the first time I saw it. I think what helps is when you're introduced at a young age, it becomes a little bit more critic-proof to you, perhaps, if you're indoctrinated, I guess, as a youngster maybe. But again, this phenomenon of the backlash against it when it came out, I mean, I've heard people say it's bad filmmaking, it's poor direction, it's way too over the top with the schmaltziness, etc. But here's the thing. The film quickly went on to surpass Gone with the Wind as the all-time box office king. In fact, adjusted for inflation, today, The Sound of Music, I looked up, ranks as the 3rd highest grossing film ever, behind Gone with the Wind and Star Wars.
It's always been like that. It's always ranked really high up there because you can criticize it all you want,
right?
But people react to emotion. People react to love.
Yes.
And people react to Rodgers and Hammerstein.
Yeah.
I get chills when music swells. That's just me. You can criticize it all you want. Right. And I disagree with all those criticisms because I think it is a perfect movie, like I said before. And I was not enamored of it when I was 11.
Okay.
But I cannot tell you how many times I've seen the movie now.
Sure.
And every time I see it, the opening shot and her running up the hill gives me goosebumps.
No question about it. I feel the same way. I mean, I'm not ashamed to admit, as a 51-year-old adult male, I'll still get a little teary-eyed. Some things choke me up here watching the movie. And I think some of that is it takes me back to my childhood. And I think there's also a power in living vicariously through the discovery of the children. You see how the children discover the power of music and the love of Maria and their father. That becomes infectious. Just to finish this thought about, again, that critical backlash, in spite of the fact that today it is regarded as an all-time masterpiece. So here are some numbers just to ponder on. If you look it up on Rotten Tomatoes, it's got an impressive score. It's got 83%. The American Film Institute has placed The Sound of Music high amongst several lists. It's slotted in as the 40th best American movie of all time. That was according to the 2007 Top 100 list of the AFI.
I think that's too low.
Actually, it went higher since the first 1997 list, so it's climbed up a little bit.
Okay.
But in the list of the 100 greatest musicals, it ranks number 4 per the AFI, and 3 of its songs were named among the 100 best songs in American cinema, according to the AFI list there. So that's high praise among several different lists. I want to segue into some themes here. Julia, what do you think is the moral to the story here? What themes or messages are explored in The Sound of Music that you'd like to talk about?
Courage. I think that's one of the themes. He leaves everything he's got because he doesn't agree with, the Hitler regime. He gives up everything for that. It's self-sacrifice. It's family over everything. It's his belief in God. It doesn't matter what side you're on politically or what religion you are or if you believe or not believe. It's just moral values.
Can't argue there. Here are some other themes I identified. The power of music and its ability to serve as a healing, a unifying, a life-affirming force is a predominant theme in this film, right?
Yeah.
You think about how Maria earns the trust and the love of the children by singing to them, by teaching them music. And likewise, the captain learns to relate to his children again through the magic of music, thanks to the catalyst of Maria entering their lives. Another major message is to follow where your heart leads. Maria learns that her heart isn't truly set on being a nun. Instead, she's fallen in love with the captain. She suffers a crisis of faith and doubt, but she's advised by the mother to listen to her heart and to, quote, live the life you were born to live, unquote, and marry the captain. Now, granted, sexual politics and gender politics are very different back then, but nevertheless, it's still a good message to follow your heart. So likewise, the captain realizes that he's in love with Maria and decides to end his relationship with the Baroness. And as you eloquently mentioned a moment ago, the captain can't fathom working for the Third Reich. Despite the risks, he decides to escape the country with his family. So follow where your heart leads stands out here. Another message I saw, you tell me if you agree or disagree, is it's important to be true to yourself without conforming to sociocultural expectations. So consider how Maria is a free-spirited and outspoken kind of dreamer, and that makes her a bad nun in training and an undesirable governess to the captain, at least at first. But we see how her energetic, ebullient, and permissive and generous personality is what endears her to the children. If she was a submissive employee, the captain likely wouldn't have fallen in love with her either. And then the key to a successful family and parenthood is spending quality time together, especially time having fun, time being creative and expressive. The Von Trapps seem to be at their best when they are singing and performing collectively. And as their clever escape from the Nazis demonstrates at the end of the picture, they survive and thrive as a collective unit when they work together.
Well, you've thought of a lot of things I never thought of, so I think it's great.
Well, it's not like I invented these thoughts, but they just rise to the surface a little more easily the more times you see the movie.
You know, I mean, I never thought of music as sort of the healing power. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Can you see this story as kind of a Cinderella fairy tale story a little bit too? Does that work for you on that level?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, because you kind of have like this misfit princess in the rough who falls for the handsome royal prince and wins his heart in the end.
And she was sort of, you know, the sweeper. She was sweeping the floors, sort of, and became the princess. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, in a roundabout way. I mean, if we wanted to, we could have a field day with "You belong to him now." And it was interesting, Julia, when I watched the movie again last night, I suddenly realized that once all the singing is over and once she comes back to the house, after Mother tells her to go back.
She's very subservient, isn't she?
Oh my God. She's quiet. She's like, I don't know, kind of like quiet, like a dormouse. She just totally acquiesces to whatever the captain says or does. And I understand it's
a different time.
A different time. So what elements from The Sound of Music do you think have aged well, and what elements maybe are showing some wrinkles? It's been 55 years, so every movie starts to get a little long in the tooth. Anything stand out here?
Well, I do think that she does acquiesce a little bit when she comes home from getting married. It's whatever the captain wants to do.
Right.
And that's probably aged a bit. Other than that, I think the power of music, the power of family togetherness is definitely very current.
Sure.
I really don't see this movie aging a lot.
Oh, I would agree.
Because of everything that I've already said about all the basics of it and the romance of the music, which I don't think will ever be out of style.
Agreed. Absolutely. Again, I'm not trying to pile on here. I think the fantastic scenery and cinematography, as we talked about, they've helped this movie age so gracefully.
Right.
The incredible performance by Julie Andrews, I mean, it can't be understated here. It stands as a testament to the power of perfect casting at the right time. The only thing that stands out as problematic to me is, and again, you have this problem in a lot of movies, especially older films, is sometimes with the casting of child actors, you get some wooden performances or you get some unrealistic dialogue. I think the problem here is you've got a large cast, and most of the children aren't that well developed as characters. They sometimes can lack interesting personalities, some of the ones in between, the middle kids. And some of them aren't the world's greatest actors, but they do a good enough job. It's just you've got such a big sprawling movie with such a large cast, you can't possibly devote too much time to any one particular child per se. But to me, that stands out a little bit. I've seen better child acting in movies. I've seen worse. But what would you say there?
I don't think it really makes a difference. I don't think it was that important. I think they were a whole. It was the 7 kids, except for the oldest one, Liesel. She was the main character. The rest, it really didn't matter. I just think they represented whomever they needed to represent.
Okay. Yeah, I would agree to some extent. So we're celebrating The Sound of Music's 55th birthday. It's not the 50th. We weren't around as a podcast back then to celebrate, but it's not too late. 55th is still a grand old number. Only instead of us giving The Sound of Music presents, I contend that it's the fans who continue to get the gifts. So, Julia, what is this film's greatest gift to viewers?
I think it's family night. I think it's getting together with your kids, with your parents, watching a really great movie with wonderful music that talks about the values of family, whether it's on Easter or Christmas or whatever it shows now. I mean, when I was a kid, I was watching Peter Pan with Mary Martin, and I was watching The Wizard of Oz. And it's something you remember the rest of your life because you got together as a family.
Yes.
And I think that's its greatest gift.
Can't argue there. I would say it's got several greatest gifts. I think its greatest single gift continues to be its songbook. And not only are these numbers instantly recognizable, hummable, and infectious, they work so well to advance the story and the characters and relationships. Thanks often to genius lyrics, the songs eliminate the need for exposition, often propelling the narrative forward more efficiently than dialogue and action could alone. So you think, for example, the action of Do Re Mi. It's a 4-minute or so song, but it takes place over several weeks. In fact, in the bonus features I was watching, Julie Andrews says you pretty much show the entirety of the children spending the summer with Maria in that song. Pretty much the whole summer. Yep. It's amazing.
And that's Ernest Lehman again. He did that because in the play, it took place just like, it was like a 5-minute thing, and he was teaching them how to sing. But it was Ernest Lehman who opened it up and said, this is going to be the arc of their relationship.
I think another greatest gift is we live in a cynical postmodern age. It's easy to scoff at breakout into song musicals and too good to be true type stories about wholesome families in 2020, right? For a lot of us anyway. But it's hard not to be moved by the story of the Von Trapps, considering that the core story we're shown has actually happened. Its message that it's never too late to fix a broken family is still important. So another greatest gift, to me anyway, is the movie's power to inspire parents and families to work harder at showing love and patience and kindness and to find common interests together. So maybe that common interest is singing. Maybe it's puppet shows. Maybe it's hiking in the mountains. Whatever it is, this film tells us that there's hope that even the most dysfunctional of families can change.
Absolutely. In fact, I never thought about it like that. No, seriously, I do.
We're gonna have to write a sequel to your book together. No, just kidding. Anyway, it's a movie that takes you back to your childhood, if that's when you first watched it or were impressed by it, or even if you saw it first as an adult, maybe it still takes you back to your childhood because you, as I said, you kind of put yourself in the shoes of the Von Trapp children and the joy that they experience in Maria's presence. Or maybe it's because you remember first seeing and falling in love with the movie as a child. And lastly, Julia, the incredible exterior visuals are a gift that just keeps on giving. This is one of the great examples of a movie serving as kind of like a board of tourism marketing tool to get viewers immersed in and intrigued to visit a foreign country. So when you think of other examples, like, let's say Manhattan, the movie Manhattan, it serves as a visual love letter to New York. The film Amelie, if you've ever seen that,
Sure.
it poetically portrays Paris. Rome becomes a wonderfully romantic getaway in Roman holiday. And The Quiet Man, it paints our imagination about Ireland green, right? So to me, The Sound of Music, it makes you want to vacation to Salzburg and explore Austria. There's just no question. Every time I see it, I just think, this looks like one of the most beautiful places on planet Earth, and someday it's got to be on the bucket list. Have you ever visited the filming locations?
I have not, but there is still a whole industry in Salzburg based on The Sound of Music. There's Sound of Music tours that are going on as we speak. And in fact, I've been in touch with many of the people that provide them, and just had a friend like 2 years ago who said, okay, I'm going to Salzburg, hit me up, get me connected with a tour, for the whole Sound of Music thing. So yes, it has developed a whole industry in Salzburg.
Before we conclude here, I want to ask you, Julia, it's 55 years now for The Sound of Music. Do you think this movie is still going to be widely watched and considered relevant in another 55 years? Now, you and I may not be around, but tell me why.
Absolutely, for all the reasons that we've talked about for this whole show. I mean, there are some things that will never change. The values, the courage, everything that we've been talking about throughout this whole hour, they're part of our human experience. They will never change. So it could be, 100, it could be, well, who knows? It could be robots in 500 years. It could be Matrix or something. But
maybe they'll preserve our brains somehow miraculously.
But as long as there are human beings, those values, those experiences, those emotions will never change.
Well said. Yeah, I don't worry much about a 55-year-old film that remains this popular. It continues to be shown on broadcast TV, usually once a year on ABC. And now that Disney owns the rights, it offers the movie on its streaming channel, Disney Plus. It should continue to earn new generations of fans, so I'm not too worried about it. Some of these movies we pick for Cineversary, I'm more worried. Like, is there still going to be an audience for this old film noir or something like that in 50, 60, 70 years? But The Sound of Music, I have confidence, as Maria would, that it's going to stick around. I want to ask you before we conclude, too, is there any particularly interesting story you can briefly share with us that you include in your book? Anything that perhaps Robert Wise or another member of the cast told you that you found particularly fascinating?
Well, there's something fun. For instance, the scene in Silhouette when the captain and Maria are expressing their love for each other and they kiss for the first time.
Right.
That scene was actually shot that way by accident. And it's kind of a funny story. The whole cast and crew had just come back from Salzburg and they were exhausted. They had like one weekend to kind of rest. And then Monday morning, they were back on the set. And Julie Andrews told me, she said, when I get tired, I get very giggly. And one of the first scenes they shot was that scene in the gazebo when they expressed their love for each other. And there was, the way it was shot was there was an arc light that was shooting them from the top. It worked by rubbing two pieces of carbon together. And so every time they would do the scene and they would express their love for each other, they would just about kiss. And every time they would get to that point, the pieces of carbon would rub together and create like a raspberry sound, like a kind of sound. And just as they were about to kiss, so they would start cracking up, both of them. And they did this over and over again. And every single time that old arc light would just as they were about to kiss. Well, they got so giggly. Bob Wise got really frustrated. He said, okay, we're going to break for lunch. And so Julie Andrews walked around the studio and she was talking to herself and she was saying, okay, I'm going to calm down and blah, blah, blah. And they would get together and the same thing would happen after lunch. The same thing every time they were about to kiss.
Of course,
so finally,
right.
Robert Wise said, forget that light. Let's shoot him in the dark and we'll get done with the scene. And that's why it's shot in silhouette.
Necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. That's a great story.
And it turned out to be a great way to shoot it.
Yeah, I can't picture the scene any other way. Yeah. It turned out to be a stroke of good fortune for the viewer as well. So that's a great story. I was curious, is there a favorite person you interviewed for your book? Anybody stand out in terms of the folks that you were able to talk to about the making of the movie or any of the actors involved?
I will tell you there is, and it's going to be somebody unexpected. It was Zuby, Maurice Zubinato.
Who's that?
He did the storyboards. He was the artist because in those days they didn't have computers. So he actually did the painting and the drawings of all the storyboards that went along with the picture. And I loved him. He was so sweet. He was so great. He shared so many stories. So, I mean, he's an odd one to pick. You know, I mean, they were all wonderful. Ernie Lehman, I mean, he just took me under his wing. He was like a mentor throughout the whole thing. Everybody was so excited because this book was done like in the early 90s before a lot of these books were done. And
Is that right? Okay.
I got carte blanche to all of 20th Century Fox. They said, come in and take whatever you want. I spent months there looking through all their pictures, and they said, take anything you want. That doesn't happen these days.
No, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was great.
How cool. Wow. So this book was many years in the making?
So it originally came out in 1993, and then it was just reissued in 2018, where I updated what has happened to a lot of the players and, you know, what's happened since then with the sing-alongs, all the other things that have happened with the movie since then.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, we'll keep an eye out for that, and that's, of course, available on Amazon and through other booksellers, right?
Correct.
Terrific. Well, Julia, I want to thank you again for your generous time and talking with us and recollecting about The Sound of Music, especially your personal recollections with the director and some of the other folks involved with the movie. It was a real treat to dish on Sound of Music with you and celebrate 55 years.
Thank you, Eric.
Gracias, Julia, for making time to appear on Cineversary and to share your memories and opinions on The Sound of Music. And now it's time for another edition of Standing Ovations. This is where I give a shout out to a movie, book, website, TV program, podcast, or other work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers. Well, like me, you're likely sequestered at home waiting out the coronavirus. What better time to do some classic film binge watching? Only not everyone is lucky enough to have cable TV or a subscription to Netflix, Amazon Prime, or the Criterion Channel, right? So if you're on a budget but yearn to watch some quality flicks from yesteryear, hey, I've done some digging and I've found that many memorable movies are available to watch uncut for free on YouTube. So among the gratis goodies are Carnival of Souls, Charade, Detour, DOA, The Front Page, The General, His Girl Friday, The Gold Rush, Kansas City Confidential, Love Affair, The Man with the Golden Arm, Meet John Doe, My Man Godfrey, Night of the Living Dead, Nosferatu, Nothing Sacred, Oliver Twist, One-Eyed Jacks, Quicksand, Royal Wedding, Scarlet Street, A Star is Born from 1937, and Orson Welles' The Stranger. That's a mouthful there. No, these are not bootlegged or pirated copies you're watching. In many cases, these features fell into the public domain, folks, which means they can be shown without copyright infringement on the internet. And there are dozens more you can find, too, if you do a Google search of the words public domain films on YouTube. So while you're stuck at home for the foreseeable future, this could be a great window in which to catch up on some all-time great movies. Yep, that about wraps it up for this month's anniversary. I'd love to hear what you think of our show. Do you want to offer some suggestions or comments? Well, you can reach me, Eric Martin, at cineversegroup@gmail.com. That's CINEVERSE group@gmail.com. I further encourage you to check out cineversegroup.com, which is the portal for my Cineverse film discussion group I launched 14 years ago, and like I said, which until recently, at least, continued to meet weekly in the South Suburban Chicago area. We'll get back to business soon, I'm sure. Cineverse is a democratic film society that watches and then discusses a predetermined movie that our members pick on a rotating basis. At cineversegroup.com, you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the films we study. Also, instead of cluttering up this podcast with advertisements, we've decided to ask our listeners for their support, so we could use your help to offset the costs to produce Cineversary, which includes expenses like podcast hosting provider fees. If you'd like to make a monetary contribution to the Cineversary podcast in any amount, large or small, we've made it safe and simple by partnering with PayPal to collect the funds. All you have to do is visit tinyurl.com/donate Cineversary and click on the Donate button. Any major credit card is accepted and the entire transaction is handled securely and confidentially by PayPal. Or if you're familiar with PayPal, you can simply send us a payment in any amount you want to cineversegroup@gmail.com. As always, people, we really appreciate your generosity. Curious what's on the schedule for May? We're going to journey back to 18th century China for a visually poetic and acrobatic adventure with Ang Lee, director of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which marks a 20th anniversary next month. This has been your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, cherish those classic movies, and of course, stay safe and healthy throughout these challenging times. Remember that things will get better, just like these favorite films do with each rewatch. Thanks for giving us a listen.